we'll just... yeah, that's us recording. So Viv, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I'll just share my screen. Sorry, where does it say? It's annoying how there's a bar at the top which hides what you actually want to do. So I'm just trying to find how to get this started. Any ideas?
Okay, there we go.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Can everyone see that slide? And can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All gone right. Okay, Ian, so shall I just fire away then? Is everybody here that you're expecting? Hello?
Hang on, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Ian. Do you want to wait?
Yeah. No, I think we're good. I think this is
right.
Everybody here. So we'll just fire on.
That's grand. Well, good morning, everybody. We've had a few technical issues, as you can appreciate. When Zoom works, it's very useful, isn't it? But it doesn't always quite play the game. So poor Ian's tearing his hair out, but we've got there. So well done, Ian. Nice to not quite meet you, everybody. I'm Viv Halgrow, and I'm the Croft Woodland advisor for the Woodland project in the Western Isles. So this morning, I'm just going to give you really very much an overview of what the project's about. And then, so something about the background and what progress we've made to date, and funding options and that kind of thing. And then if people have questions, we can maybe have more of a discussion at the end of my wee presentation here, if that's okay with everyone. Perhaps, Ian, you could monitor if people want to make comments in the chat or something like that.
Yeah,
perhaps you could monitor that.
I can do that.
We can field questions at the end.
I can sort that. Yep, that's
Brilliant.
not an issue.
Okie doke. So let's just get started then. So most of you are probably aware of the Croft Forestry Act in 2010, which is only 11 years ago. No, it's not. Yes, it is. So it's actually fairly recent. And this was prior to this date, crofters had very little rights over the trees that if they wanted to plant trees on their ground, they had very little rights over the use of them. The landlord had the majority of the rights. So there was little incentive for people to plant trees. But when that act came through in 2010, that made a big difference, and it meant that the trees on your ground are actually now sort of under the crofters' control. And so there was quite an upsurge in interest in planting trees, and a fair amount of trees were planted. I'm sort of talking throughout the crofting counties here. But a wee bit later on, there was quite a sort of tail off in planting, and the Forestry Commission actually looked into what the reasons for this were, what the barriers were to people planting. And there were two main things that came out, and it won't surprise you to hear that one of them was access to funding. There wasn't the necessary funding to enable people to be able to do what they wanted in terms of planting trees. And the other one was just really a lack of kind of know-how. I think particularly in the Western Isles, woodlands and forestry planting is not something that it's not kind of part of the culture, I suppose. And so there was a bit of a lack of knowledge in how to go about planting trees such that they would establish and grow successfully. So these two things, the lack of funding and the lack of kind of know-how, came together to inspire the beginnings of the Croft Woodland project. And it was really Callum MacDonald, who used to be the MP in the Western Isles, who kind of got the project started, because he's always been very, very keen on forestry and woodlands, and he actually pushed through the Forestry Act. And so he kind of inspired the Croft Woodland project. to get going. The project itself extends throughout all the crofting counties, so it's not just active in the Western Isles, it's all the way from Shetland through Orkney, Highland and Argyll and all the Argyll Islands. So it's a big area that we're covering, and there's various people a bit like me that do more or less what I do in all these different areas. So we have a team of, I think, 5 people, perhaps 6 people in these different areas. Obviously, we're all scattered about, but we have the occasional Zoom meeting, which with various degrees of success, and that kind of keeps us all in touch with each other. So it's interesting that, you know, there's people doing the same kind of work in all these different areas. So who's involved in the project here? Well, Point and Sandwick Trust is a major player in that. Well, Callum MacDonald, whom I mentioned just now, he's one of the directors in Point and Sandwick Trust, and they actually fund the post in the Western Isles. Obviously, at the moment, there's a bit of an issue there with the cable break last October, but then it's one of the joys of partnership working is that Woodland Trust Scotland, which is actually my employer, they were able to step in and underpin my post so we could keep the project going, which was a great relief to me personally, but also because there's such a high demand. It would have been, I think, really sad if the project had just had to fold. Other partners involved are Scottish Forestry, which used to be the Forestry Commission, as I'm sure you're all aware. They're very, very helpful, and I work closely with Donald MacLeod, who's the woodland officer who's based in Dingwall, but he has Western Isles as part of his patch. And he's from Stornoway originally, so he completely understands the island situation. Scottish Crofting Federation are also closely involved, and they help particularly with things like training sessions and that side of things. And then there's local partners. So this is really applying to, you know, the whole of the project. So local partners here obviously is Point and Sandwick Trust, but in other parts of the Highlands and Argyll, there's different partners involved too. So what's it all about? Well, it's really about getting trees planted and looking after them such that they establish successfully, and very much about supporting crofters to develop their ideas and to be able to actually carry out what they're interested in doing on the ground. So it's a very practical project, I would say. Just a brief overview. The project actually started in 2015, but it really became active, started kind of being active on the ground from 2016. And the first 5-year phase finished in 2020. And at that point, we thought the project was perhaps, you know, had not run its course, but the funding might have run its course, and we might have to just hand over the work to other organisations and things. But luckily, again, Point and Sandwick Trust, they stepped in and said, well, look, there's such a demand and such enthusiasm for it, it'd be great to keep it going. And so they committed to funding my post here for another 5 years, and then the other partners stepped in and also committed to another 5 years. So we're active till 2025 and potentially beyond that as well. Anything to do with trees is a long-term process, and so it's good to have that extra backing, and hopefully it will go on into the future. As I said, there's been a huge demand in the Western Isles, I think actually more than any other of the areas, interestingly. I've had, since I started in 2016, I've had over 600 inquiries, and that's throughout the Western Isles, so from Barra to the Butt. So there's a vast amount of interest, and it's obviously, it takes quite a bit of time to get around and visit all the crofts and help people with their aspirations, but I'm plugging away at it and trying to keep on top of things. It's been a bit complicated this past year with being furloughed and COVID restrictions, but things are lightening up a bit now, so I'm getting on top of my backlog, hopefully. There's various funding options, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. But there's one called More Woods, which is the Woodland Trust's funding scheme. And then there's the Forestry Grant Scheme, which is through what used to be through SRDP. It's now through Scottish Government. And there's a shelter belt grant through the Crofting Agricultural Grant Scheme. And then Woodland Trust also does free packs of trees for community groups and for schools. So all these things are of interest depending on what kind of planting you're wanting to do. So far, we've planted, through the project, planted over 140,000 trees in about 45, just over 45 hectares. It's quite a number of trees, but we're planting them often in quite small groups, often groups of 300 trees, and maybe a bit bigger than that, and very close together, very close spacing, which is because it's such a windy climate. They benefit from mutual shelter as they're getting established. And so it's good to have them planted close together. So although it's quite a number of trees, it's not a big area as such. So by no means are we going to cover the Western Isles in trees, as some people have kind of slightly disgruntledly pointed out. You're going to cover the place in trees and change it. I don't think so. I mean, as I see it, small groups of trees, sympathetically located, are going to actually enhance the landscape, as well as benefits for wildlife and all the rest of it. So these figures are based on a total of the different funding schemes available and the school and community packs right through the islands. A lot of interest in Lewis and to an extent in Harris, less in the Uists, which is perhaps because a lot of the ground is a lot less, well, it's not very suitable. There's a lot of very sandy ground and a lot of peat and rocky ground. So there's less kind of available good ground. Barra, there's a lot of interest in Barra. So it's quite good to see that level of interest. So why would you want to plant trees? What's the point in planting trees? If there's any people that aren't quite sure here, then maybe this will help to sway you. I don't know. The main one probably, which many people are planting because of, if you like, is shelter. So obviously shelter for livestock, shelter for crops, and also shelter for buildings. If you plant fairly close to buildings, that will give you a reasonable amount of shelter to them as well and help with heating bills and all the rest of it. So that's a really major one. Also, the trees improve soil fertility because we're mainly planting native broadleaf trees, so they lose their leaves in the winter, obviously. And when those leaves rot down into the upper layers of soil, they help to improve the topsoil. So that over time, that can have a really good effect on the soil. A wildlife benefit, certainly you start to see a lot of different species. If you plant trees, you'll see different birds coming in and lots of different insects, invertebrates, moths and that kind of thing. So that's a lot of people are interested in that aspect. Landscape diversity, I mentioned briefly before, so little pockets of woodland spaced about all over the place. Hopefully will add to the landscape interest rather than detracting from the lovely wide open spaces that we enjoy at the moment. Wood fuel is a practical use. So once your trees have been in the ground for a certain amount of time, then you can expect certainly some thinnings and some coppice wood. And craft products, many people like to plant willow to use the willow for basketry or even for making creels and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of benefits there. We can discuss more about that later on if you like. But I think there's good reasons for planting trees. There's also the carbon capture aspect, which I haven't got on this list, but many people ask me about carbon capture and whether trees are a good thing. And certainly they are if you're planting on ground which isn't too peaty. If it's very peaty ground, well, we don't plant on deep peat, but if it's peaty ground, then the trees might actually, the initial stages of tree growing might liberate as much carbon as they lock in. So from a carbon capture point of view, planting on what they call mineral soils, so soils derived from rock, is a better way to go. So just an example of shelter. This is in South Uist, which is a pretty windy spot. This is actually beside the school at Uachtar, and they've managed to get this established by using a para-webbing fencing, which is itself is kind of leaning away from the Atlantic winds. But it has enabled the shelter belt to get established behind it, and it's really dense. And on the other side of the shelter belt, you can really feel the difference. And I've managed to capture a little bird in flight in the top of that one, although it's a bit fuzzy. So there's a bit of wildlife in there too. You'll probably be familiar with this area, which you can see from the main road as you're traveling through Harris. And I always find this a really striking view because the hill behind is so rocky, and the foreground is quite peaty and tussocky grass and heather and that. And then you've got this area of woodland in the centre, and I think it just breaks up the landscape and really softens it. It looks nice. Woodfield we mentioned. You can certainly this is actually taken up in Ness, so you can grow trees even in Ness and get some product for your fire. So where are the best places to plant trees? Well, you're looking at a range of features really. So it's to get them successfully established, it's really helpful if you've got an area of ground where there's a little bit of what we call topographic shelter, which is just shelter provided by the lie of the land. So if you have if you're in amongst maybe some rocky knolls, but there's a low lying bit, which is maybe a bit damper and a bit more sheltered, then that would be ideal. Any kind of shelter like that helps. Just even being on the lee slope can help a fair bit, or even shelter from buildings as well can help as well. A certain degree of fertility in the soil really helps to get the trees established. So, I mean, I tell that as I'm going around to crofts, just through what vegetation is growing on the soil, as well as doing taking a core of soil to have a look at what it's actually like. But basically, if it's very poor ground, if it's very, heathery and rough grasses, then it's perhaps not, the trees would struggle to get established. I'm not saying they wouldn't grow, but they might be really slow and need quite a lot of fertilizer to get them established. So soil fertility is one to think about. A lot of the planting that we're doing is actually on people's crofts, and so often the soil is amazingly good because it's been worked for a long time. So, it's been cultivated or it's been heavily grazed, and the dunging has made a big difference to the soil nutrient levels. So we're mainly planting on people's crofts. Common grazings is a bit more problematic because the ground tends to be very poor. And we have to avoid deep peat, partly from a carbon release point of view, which we don't want to do, partly because, well, the grants, it's ineligible for grant if you're talking about planting on deep peat. And by deep peat, I mean just over 0.5 metre, which isn't very deep, really, in our part of the world. I think the way to think about it is that the peatlands themselves are of enormous global importance, which we tend to undervalue them, really, but they are of huge importance globally, partly for the carbon that they hold and partly for the wildlife that's associated with them. So there's lots of reasons really for not planting on deep peat. Other constraints that there might be to planting are if there's any designations over the site, like SSSIs or SPAs or that kind of thing, or if there's utilities that run through your croft, like electric lines or water mains, those you just need to leave a way leave, but be very careful not to plant under or near those. Just a word about species. We're mainly planting native broadleaf species, as I mentioned earlier, and it's always best to get ones of as local a genetic type as you can. The ones that are my kind of mainstay are common alder, downy birch, grey willow, and eared willow. They seem to establish pretty well on most ground, even on fairly poor ground. If the ground is relatively fertile, as on crofts, then you can certainly plant some aspen, hazel, hawthorn, even bird cherry on quite fertile, damp ground, and oak and rowan. Had good success with all these species throughout the Western Isles. So, and there's others, that's not an exhaustive list, but these will all do fine. And of course, there's non-natives that you can plant. Not all the grant schemes support them, but some of them do. So sycamore is quite a useful one. I'm sure you'll be familiar with sycamore. It's often planted around houses. It's very, very salt hardy, salt tolerant. It doesn't mind the salty winds. And so obviously that's a good adaptation for here. And it can grow to be quite a big tree, but often it doesn't particularly, but it's a good growing tree. And there's various non-native willows as well, which are quite useful. And in terms of conifers, I think lodgepole pine is probably the best one for planting on the kind of soils we have here, although Sitka spruce will do okay if the soil's a wee bit drier. And then there's a lot of really hardy shrubs, which are mainly people think of as garden shrubs, perhaps like Escallonia, New Zealand holly, Olearia, excuse me, fuchsia, New Zealand flax, all those kind of things. Rosa rugosa, which is a bit of a Marmite species, you either love it or hate it. All those shrubs are really useful for kind of initial shelter because they get growing quickly, and many of them you can establish from cuttings, which is a nice kind of cheap way of doing things. And yeah, they provide shelter for the trees which you actually want to grow if you plant them in behind. So they're all quite useful things. And we're lucky now because there's a nursery, well, there's two nurseries in Lewis now, which is really great. And they're both concentrating on using locally collected seed, so seed from the Western Isles, and they're growing it on there. So obviously it's genetically adapted, but it's also being grown on under local conditions. So it's the strongest, toughest trees you're going to be able to buy from anywhere. I have to say this photograph is a bit of a cheat because this isn't, very obviously, is not in the Western Isles. This is the Trees for Life nursery at Dundragon in Glenmoriston. But there's a similar setup in Lurbost, although he doesn't have as much space to play with. He's working quite a small area, but producing a lot of very healthy trees. And that's Stark's Ark at Lurbost. And then the Horshedder Trust, it's got a nursery in development in Shawbost. And they're also producing nice, healthy trees. And I'm hoping in time, I'm supporting these quite a bit through my work, just with advice really. And also they've become registered suppliers to Woodland Trust, so we can use these nurseries to buy stock for our planting schemes. And I'm hoping that in time there'll be many more local nurseries because, as I said, there's such a demand that we can't keep up with supply really at the moment. So we're still having to bring in planting stock from the mainland. But in that case, I always get planting stock which is of as near a genetic type as I can get. So that'd be from Skye or from Sutherland or Wester Ross. So it's pretty well adapted to the same kind of conditions as we get here, albeit not quite so extreme. Some practicalities if you're thinking about planting trees. The first one is how to prepare the ground. So this partly depends on what grant you're going with. If you're going with a grant, the forestry grant scheme is very prescriptive about ground preparation. They want to see the ground mounded with a digger. And you may have seen that done on various sites. Otherwise, it's always best just to, if you can, to turn over a bit of ground, whether you plough it or just turn it over with a spade, just to kind of mix up the soil a bit and incorporate oxygen into the soil, which is really good for the roots, important for the roots establishment. It also helps a bit with drainage, and it means that you've got a space around the tree which is free of weeds for the first season or so, and that really helps. So a bit of ground preparation is a good idea. It's quite hard work, but if you're doing it by hand, but it's certainly one to think about. because it will help the trees establish more successfully. Fencing, you'll definitely need to keep obviously sheep out and obviously deer as well, if you're in a deer area. And I know that deer are spreading in Harris and moving around, so that's a bit of a nuisance. If you're putting in deer fencing, then you should be aware that if you can't put a deer fence closer than 20 metres to a road, any kind of road, not necessarily a main road, just a wee back road. If it's a public road, then you have to be 20 metres away from it or apply for planning permission for a deer fence. For any fence over 1 metre high. This was news to me, but it's a bit of a nuisance for some people because they want to, it kind of makes sense to plant right up to the roadside. Also, it's always quite a courteous thing to consult with your neighbours if you're going to be planting trees, especially if you're going to be doing deer fencing and that kind of thing, just to, you know, make sure there aren't going to be any issues, because you don't want to fall out with your neighbours. And actually with the forestry grant scheme, Scottish Forestry will directly contact your neighbours about deer fencing, so they will hear about it anyway if they don't hear about it from you. So it's best perhaps to be upfront about that. Planting design, well, that varies very much with the site, and I wasn't thinking to talk about that much this morning, but depending on how wet the ground is, it really has quite a bearing on which species you would grow and how fertile the ground is as well. So you can have patches of different species on different parts of your croft depending on what the ground is like. Protection, that's against rabbits and voles. So against rabbits, you can either use individual guards around the trees, or you can use you can put netting on the fence, the perimeter fence. The latter sounds like quite a hard work sort of option, netting the whole fence, but in actuality, as long as it works, as long as the rabbits don't manage to get underneath it, or there's any gaps in it, then it's probably a much better way of doing things than individual guards, because they themselves are a kind of maintenance issue. You have to make sure they're not blowing over or damaging the young trees or that kind of thing. So netting the fence is probably a better option. And fertiliser, just to mention that a lot of the soils here are very low in phosphate, and that's something which is really required by the plants to make good, strong roots. And so I would always recommend using a high phosphate fertiliser when you're planting. You shouldn't need to use it again after planting, but if the trees are looking a bit sort of yellowed and as if they're struggling in the first year or two, then it's quite a good idea just to give them a wee drop more. The most easily available source of high phosphate is bone meal, which is quite easy to get in garden centres and stuff. Or you can possibly get ground rock phosphate through internet sources, or the tree nurseries will supply a specialist tree fertiliser, which is high phosphate. What you don't want to use is something that's high in nitrogen, like manure, or because that promotes a lot of growth, a lot of top growth on the plant. So the trees will produce a lot of leaves and a lot of young stems before they've really made enough root. You really want them to concentrate on making root in the first couple of years. And also nitrogen will encourage growth of weedy grasses and things around the tree, which is not what you want. Just a bit about maintenance and management. Again, it's good to think about this before you start planting, because it's something that I perhaps didn't emphasize enough when I started in the job, but as I go around 5 years later, I can see a lot of crofts where people have been enthusiastic and planted and then basically haven't done much maintenance. And so the weeds can get the upper hand, because the trees, when you plant them, when they come from the nursery, they're about 20 to 40 centimetres tall. So they're about a foot tall. They establish much better if you plant them when they're small like that. But it does mean that they're liable to being smothered by growth of grasses and other plants. So you really have to be on top of the weed issue from the word go. And there's various ways of doing this. So I mentioned briefly mounding. I'll show you a picture of some mounding a bit later on, which is where a digger turns over a turf and you plant into the upside down turf. And that gives you a weed-free space for a couple of seasons. So that's really helpful, but obviously there's a cost with getting a digger involved. And sometimes access for a digger isn't easy. You can mulch, put down some kind of heavy mulch around each individual tree, which if you have a small number of trees, you know, several hundred, I'm thinking of as small, then that's quite a good option. And you can use all sorts of things for that, carpet or cardboard, or people use wet newspaper just packed around the base of the tree because that just sets hard like papier-mâché, and that's really good. Seaweed is good, although it can promote quite a bit of grassy growth because it's quite rich. So there's various things. Sheep's wool you can use as long as you put it, as long as you make the mulch sort of big enough around the tree, because again it rots down into the ground and can promote grass growth. The other thing is to murder them with weed killers, which is perfectly acceptable. And there's various ways of doing it. You can spot spray on your planting locations, each planting location rather, in the summer before you're planting. That's quite good in that it kills the grasses on that particular spot, and that makes it much easier to plant into, and it keeps the grasses at bay for a wee while, a year or so anyway. Or you can use there's a product called Curb, which you can use through the winter time. It's cold activated, so you can only use it in the winter. And it's a granulated substance that you put on just around each individual tree, and that kills grasses specifically, doesn't kill anything else. But that's quite useful if you've got quite a fertile bit of ground and you find the grasses are really growing up and choking your trees. Or of course you can just pull the weeds out by hand. That's another option. And again, it's quite doable on a smallish site. You would just have to go around a couple of times a year and be sure that the trees weren't getting smothered and pull the grasses away from around the base of the tree. That works quite well. Next thing that I've got on the slide there is beating up, which sounds a bit dramatic after murder in the last line, but I'm not getting violent really. Beating up is a term which means replacing any trees which have failed with new plants. And some of the grant schemes will insist that you do that to have the required density of plants. Obviously, it's a good idea to keep an eye out for any browsing damage. So even though you've got your rabbit fence or your guards in place, it's possible that one or two rogue beasties will get in and they can do a lot of damage really quickly. So it's good to go around a few times when the trees are getting established in the first few years and just check. Caterpillars can be a real problem, actually, especially the puss moth caterpillar, which favours willows and aspen, and they can completely defoliate young trees. So if you see those on your wanderings around your young woodland, it's a good idea just to pick them off and dispose of them. Obviously, keep an eye on any gaps that might appear in the fencing, although hopefully if you've got new fencing, that won't be an issue for quite a long time. And as I said earlier, a bit of additional fertiliser if it looks like the trees are struggling to get enough nutrient. So grants-wise, the one that I'm probably using most is the More Woods grant, which is through the Woodland Trust. It's a UK-wide scheme, so it's not confined to crofters. So there's no requirement to have a BRN or a main location code or any of those things to hand. Anybody can apply to this. It's a 60% grant, and so you pay 40% of the total of the cost of the trees and the guards and the fertiliser and delivery, and it comes as a package. And it's a really easy grant to work with because basically I do all the work for you, and then you are invoiced before the trees are delivered. We're mainly using pretty much all native species with the addition of sycamore and whitebeam, which I've requested for here because both are very, very robust and quite attractive. The downside of this grant is that there's no money in it for fencing or for labour or maintenance. So that has quite an effect for people if they're in an area, particularly an area where there's a lot of deer. This might not be such a suitable scheme. But if you have an area which is already fenced say, or partly fenced, and you can cope with covering the cost of the rest of the fencing yourself. And if it's a small number of trees, you might be able to do the labour, the planting yourself and the weeding. And it works well for a lot of people. Consequently, it's very popular, and there's quite a waiting list for this scheme, I'm afraid. But I think I do about 24, 25 of these schemes every winter. So there's quite a lot of these going through. And it's now funded by Lloyd's Bank as part of their carbon offset scheme. So hence there's a 30-year agreement, and you're meant to maintain the woods for that 30-year period, which has changed. It used to be a 12-year agreement when it was direct with Woodland Trust, but that's recently changed. So that's a useful grant. And I've just got a few pictures of some more woods plantings. This is in Shawbost, where quite a low-lying, wet bit of pasture has been planted up, 600 trees. These photos don't look great because I think most of the photos I took quite early on, and so it's kind of ranks and ranks of tree tubes, which doesn't look brilliant. If you go back there now, you'll see that there's lots and lots of fluffy little trees, which is much more attractive. This is in Econishin Point, a similar thing, very fertile ground. So these trees now, this was just after planting, these trees now they're well over my height. They're probably 2 meters tall, well, definitely 2 meters tall, most of these. And this was planted 3 years ago, I think. This guy was very keen and hand-mounded 600 trees here, and then asked for more the following year. So he's a glutton for punishment. This is quite a nice one in that you'll see there's a fence going down the centre, sort of away from us towards the sea. This is in Braga in Lewis. And there's 2 crofts on either side of that fence, and they both decided they're quite good friends, and they decided that they wanted to plant trees on each side of the fence. So they each planted, I think it was 1,200 trees each. So now, and again, this is a few years old, this photo, I'm afraid. I must go around and take then and now photos. Now you go there and it's all fluffy trees and it's lovely. Quite a nice feature in the landscape in that low-lying damp ground before you get to that rockier ground in the distance there. And the sea is just beyond. I don't know if you can make it out on the slide. It's a wee bit pale, but the sea isn't far away. But the trees have established amazingly well because it's fertile, I guess. Now in this case, the crofter here is in Point, again, sorry, it's a Sandwick. The crofter has used the Morewoods grant scheme to create a shelter belt around in an L shape around his croft. He decided not to go with the CAG's shelter belt scheme because he didn't have a need to put in an internal fence, and the fence on the outside was perfectly fine. So he didn't need the finance for fencing, and he was able to do the work himself. And so he decided not to go with the slight hassle that can be the CAG's grant, and went with the Morewoods grant. So these are all doing very merrily now. This one's in Harris. So just to show that even on quite rocky ground, there's usually a wee patch of soil where you can find a sheltered space with better ground and you can plant. So this person has planted 3 sort of blocks of trees, if you like, on his croft and better ground. So that's just an idea of what some of the Morewood schemes can look like. Tend to be quite small. They tend to be 300 trees, between 300 and 600 trees, I'd say, is what most people go for. Another option is the forestry grant scheme, which is perhaps a more serious undertaking, is really designed for slightly larger areas. The minimum area for this one is 1/4 hectare, which is 50 by 50 meters, which isn't massive in a crofting sense, but it's a fair chunk. And it's capped at 3 hectares. So anywhere between those 2 sizes, you can go for a forestry grant scheme. The eligibility rules are quite strict on this one. So basically, well, it's public money. So I suppose basically they're quite risk averse. And so they want to know the scheme is going to establish successfully. So they're definitely looking at areas which have a bit of shelter and which have better ground. And it's based on an area payment, in addition to which there's a fencing allowance, and obviously that can include deer fencing. And in fact, they wouldn't approve any FGS application without deer fencing if it's in Lewis and probably now in Harris. We used to get away with it in South Harris, but there's definitely deer moving into South Harris now. So I think future schemes in South Harris might require deer fencing, which was quite an undertaking on some of that rocky ground and therefore expensive. Anyway, there is a fencing allowance within the forestry grant scheme, but it's a standard rate of £9.90 a metre, which probably won't quite meet costs. Well, it won't meet costs, but it'll go quite a long way towards it. There's also funding towards, if you want individual rabbit guards or netting on the fence, there's funding towards that, and funding for gates. And then in addition to all that, you've got 5 years of an annual management grant, which again is based on the area that you're planting. So it is a useful grant. We're doing quite a lot of forestry grant schemes, but as I say, the eligibility rules are quite strict, and sometimes the finances just don't work out very well. But what I do is I do an estimate for people. We sort of map the area that people are interested in planting, and then I'll do an estimate of costs. I can see very clearly what the income will be, but the outgoings can vary a lot because they do want digger work done, the outgoings can vary depending on local costs, different contractor costs, and also if you can do any of the work yourself, that obviously makes a big difference. Because unlike some grants, this doesn't ask for quotes or invoices or receipts or anything like that. You know what the income's going to be. The outgoings are up to you as long as the work is done to standard. And so if you can do the work yourself, or if you've got friendly local contractors or something, that can make a big difference. It's a 20-year contract, and as with any grant, with most grants, you pay out first and then you have to reclaim the grant. So there can be quite a big upfront cost, but we have Scottish Forestry now has a loan available, and Woodland Trust also has a loan, and you can use the two in tandem. So we're hoping that will really help people to go for this one. This is just to show you kind of what I mean by mounding. This is in Grimsay, actually, in North Uist. So the guy is turning over a big turf there with a bucket and tipping it over and back into the hole. So traditionally, well, in days of yore, mounding used to be done. We'd turn over turf and leave it by the side of the hole that it had come from. So you'd be left with this kind of bomb site of lots of big holes and sticky up bits, which is not good in lots of ways. It means that walking around the site is quite problematic. Once the vegetation grows in a bit, it can be really quite dangerous from the point of view of twisting your ankle and things. And also it means that the tree is raised up when you plant onto the mound. And so the tree is raised up, which in a windy climate is not a good plan. So now we do what's called inverted mounding. So that's basically, you end up with the ground looking, there's no raised up bits. Basically, you can see it in the background there on that slide. Hopefully, there's no kind of raised areas. It's all pretty flat, but they've turned over a turf, and that mixes the soil, keeps the weeds down, and incorporates oxygen, and gives you a much easier place to plant into. This site's ready for planting. It's got a new deer fence around it, and it's all been mounded, so it's ready to go. And the planting itself, because a lot of people choose to do it, themselves, it can be quite a sort of sociable experience. This is my husband getting a bit close to somebody, not me, having a sociable time with a tree planter in Grimsay. So it can be quite a nice thing for a group of people to do, as long as you're not on a massive scale where it becomes a bit backbreaking. And also, of course, all these different aspects which are requirements under the grant can provide employment opportunities for local contractors. So that's always a bonus. So fencers and digger drivers and people who are growing the trees and all those things, it's all add-on work. That's just another picture of a croft, this time in Burnery, which is where I stay. Just across from me, this, and this is ready for planting now. And a couple of years later, it looks like this. So, and in fact now, it looks even more fluffy than that. So the trees have taken very well. It's on a lee slope, so it's not getting prevailing winds. And the ground is quite good. There's quite a lot of old lazy beds on this ground. So that obviously indicates greater fertility in the soil. The ground's been worked in the past. In terms of grants, the other grant that's available is a shelter belt grant through CAGS. As with all CAGS grants, this one is to do with improving your croft business. So if you're not keeping livestock or you don't have a horticultural business, then you'd have to really argue your case to get this grant. I know people that have applied for it and they've just been turned down because it's not improving the financial business of their croft. But if you do have livestock or you do have a horticultural business, then it's worth finding out about. The grant is quite useful in that it covers 80% of costs if you're less than 41 years old, 60% of costs if you're over 41, and it's based on actual costs. So you do need to go through the whole quotes, invoices, receipts situation, but it has got finance in it. Well, it's got an allowance in it for labour and for fencing, so that's quite handy. If people are interested in this one, I just really recommend that they just go and talk to the department direct, because they will know the sort of up-to-date situation regarding how much finance is available and that kind of thing, and they'll be able to guide you with it. So I mainly deal with the other two grants, the Woodland Trust grant and the Forestry grant scheme. We also have community and tree packs, which are free, and these are quite popular, not just because they're free, I hope, but quite a lot of community groups want to plant some trees, maybe around a football pitch, as here at Point in Lewis, or to fill in sort of gaps and available gaps in crofting township areas, which for amenity really. So they're quite popular, and the pack comes with obviously the trees and the guards. It's a bit like the Moorwoods: trees, guards, fertilizer, and it all just kind of is delivered to you. So it's quite a handy, quite a nice thing to do with a group of people in the community. And we've done quite a lot of school groups as well. The issue is always maintenance, because people are enthusiastic about the planting, but they're less enthusiastic about the weeding. Why is that, I wonder? What's wrong with weeding? Nobody likes weeding. So it's good to have at least 2 or 3 people who are committed to going around and checking the trees in their first few years, just to make sure that after all the nice planting day you've had and all the fun of it, then the trees are actually going to thrive and not just get swamped by grasses. Excuse me. I also do some training days. I don't do as many of these as perhaps I should, just through lack of time, really. This was a really dreich day, as you can see, up in Ness quite early on, and it was absolutely foul weather. But these hardy souls turned out, and I think we planted 600 trees in that day, which was pretty impressive given the conditions. It was February, it was blooming cold and wet and very windy. So classic Ness conditions. And at the time I thought, God, have I been a bit too optimistic here? Will these trees actually grow? But they are growing. So whenever I drive past, I have a little smile about those. We were trialing this sort of mulch matting idea around these trees, just to show people how you do it. And it's quite straightforward. You just dig in a big sheet of polythene around each tree, and it works very, very well. But it does mean that you're introducing quite a lot of plastic onto your croft, which isn't might be a brilliant thing. So we're kind of investigating alternative ways of mulching, alternative things that you can use, which are easy to use, because this is much easier to use than sheep's wool or cardboard or newspaper or all those things that I mentioned earlier. This is really very straightforward to do, and it's not expensive to buy from crofters stores. But we're looking at alternatives to this. And while we're on that, I should maybe mention that we're also looking at alternatives to the plastic tree guards, the rabbit guards. I use these mesh guards, which let the air through. The tree gains strength really by kind of wobbling around. That's the way the roots gain strength. So a solid guard is not ideal because they can't really do that. And also it means when they poke out the top, they suddenly realise what the weather's like and they kind of don't like it very much. So it's too much of a greenhouse effect with the solid guards. So I tend to use the mesh guards. The downside is that the trees will send out a lot of side shoots through the guards. So when you come to want to take them off, you have to cut the guard or cut off a few of the lower branches. The guards are reusable unless they're too cut up. And at the end of the day, they're recyclable. So they're not as bad as they might be, but we are seriously looking at alternatives to plastic guards. So that's just a bit of a gallop through really of the Croft Woodland project in the Western Isles. There is a certain amount of information and support available. We have Facebook pages. There's one which was set up for the Western Isles by somebody that came on one of my early training days, which is called Western Isles Trees on the Croft. So you can have a look at that if you do Facebook. And the Croft Woodland project itself has a Facebook page. And then Point and Sandwich Trust website, there's some information on there about the project. In Uist, there's an informal group called the Woodlanders Group, and they meet once or twice a year and go around and look at each other's woodlands and kind of share experience, which is quite a nice kind of support group and enables people with like-minded people, if you like, to get together and just sort of chat about all sorts of issues. There's also, of course, information on the Woodland Trust website, so maybe worth having a look at that if you're interested. So that there is all this information out there. And I should say as well that, if I'm helping you to plant trees on your own crop, then I won't just kind of leave you hanging once you've planted. I'm always available to give advice or come out and have a check if things aren't going as you'd like them to go. So you're not left high and dry. So that's it, folks. That's me on my morning commute to Harris in a winter day. My contact details are there if you'd like to jot them down if you want to get in touch with me at any point. And I'm sure Ian would pass them on as well. So that's really a quick run through of what I get up to. So I'll just stop screen sharing now. And then if people have questions, we can maybe discuss those.
That was excellent, Viv.
Thank you.
Just kind of the main question I had was your local crofters who have animals. What's the uptake been with them, and have they been quite keen on this scheme, or has it had a negative effect on them? Or?
No, I think very keen. A lot of people are really keen to get shelter for their livestock. And there's all sorts of scientific papers and stuff out there sort of showing what a benefit it is to have shelter for livestock. So in terms of reducing the incidence of disease and obviously, keeping lambs warmer and all that kind of thing. So it is a real benefit. And so I have a lot of people coming to me who want to plant specifically to shelter their livestock. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I'm stunned into silence. I've no idea how long I went on for. I haven't got a watch. So.
You went on quite well, actually. It was quite good. I was thinking. See,
yes, I'd like to talk.
Yes, go on, Scott.
Okay. Now, very, very
Oh.
One I'll show you over here, which is where we planted willows 20 years ago from cuttings that were from the Irishman along the road a bit, first class, and alders. The second experience was following the professional's advice on an apportionment at the top of the hill here, which has been an unmitigated disaster. So I'm really unhappy about it. However, we're about to start all over again, and I'm very happy to get new advice. Now, I noticed that the new advice changes almost yearly. We were the ones that followed faithfully the business of getting a digger to, as Viv described, put a big lump on top. And then, of course, our little tree got exposed to wind, which we hadn't thought about, but obviously has been thought about now. And we're doing inverts, which is a good plan, but too late for us. We're busy stumbling all over the apportionment into these holes. And also too late for us in that it wasn't really spelt out to me about cutting back the growth, because what I did was to diminish the stock going in there to make sure that they wouldn't eat the trees. And of course, that did happen. They didn't eat the trees, but the grass smothered them. So out of the 500 trees we planted, at our own cost, because the SAC took 3 years to come up with a grant, and people were dying and people were retiring and people couldn't do this. So we left the SAC, we bought our own trees, went ahead and planted them, and discovered this year when we're looking at everything, totally overgrown, hardly able to rescue them. The willows hadn't grown at all. The willows down there have. So we're going to start again, and some very interesting information today, but I'm not very impressed at the way things have changed. So that's my story, and I'll be pleased. I know Viv's been to see this site herself, but so have others. She's not the only one. And it just seems funny that things can change. I mean, I've never had a mesh growth on trees. I quite like that idea, mesh protectors. I did, for instance, try down at the cemetery car park down here to protect some little shrubs I was going to make into a hedge, but not only did the fence blew away, the green stuff blew away, the poles fell down, and the plants died. So that wasn't good. The wind can be very, very bad, of course, but I think we'll try again with the apportionment. I'm not just here shouting and bawling, but up for it. We're going to have another go. I was very interested in the name of Lure Boss because I use, is it Bees Green up there? I'm not sure, but if Viv would repeat the name of that local grower in Lure Boss when I'm going for some weaving just now, it'd be quite helpful to know. But
yes,
interested to hear from you now, Viv.
Okay, Scott, it's nice to see you again. It's a long time. It's a long time since I met you. Sounds like you've had mixed success with your planting, which is a real disappointment, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I can arrange to come and see you again if that would be of any use.
Yes, lovely.
And we can
talk. Very nice to you.
I'm sure you will. We can talk about these things in a bit more detail. But yeah, the mesh guards are quite good because they provide a little bit of shelter to the tree, but they don't mollycoddle it too much, so it doesn't get such a shock when it emerges from out the top. They're quite good, but certainly a lot of things are prone to blowing away. So yeah, you have to be sure. With those guards, we supply, fairly sturdy stakes, so they get hammered in, and the guards are cable tied to them, so they're pretty robust. But sometimes, the sort of mesh that you get as a sort of guard and windbreak, it's often just not strong enough to cope with our conditions here. So there's something called para-webbing, which is quite good. It's a kind of heavy duty, more like a sort of plastic. It's more like a plastic sheet with holes punched in it. And that's quite a good one to use, but it's quite expensive. You can get it on Amazon and that kind of thing. But the tree nursery that I mentioned is called Stark's Ark.
All right.
And the man's name is Frank Stark.
Thank you.
I can send, I think I've got your email address, Scott, so I can send you his details.
Okay, that'd be good. I like that because we're just about to buy some. I'm not sure if we're going to go ahead with grants or not. And sometimes I find grants can be more work getting the grant than actually using it. But it's possible. But one other reason, it's a good one, I also am interested in the tree sign. A minister here, Reverend Smith, went north. When he was here, was able to keep his croft going in Lewis because he was planting trees. And he, of course, was up for going around each tree and trimming it. So that was something I could have done if I'd thought about it or known about it. But my son might be taking over the croft here in the near future and will be absentee for a while, my eldest son. So if I planted trees in the apportionment just now on my own back, would that be seen as a good thing, part of the crofting, keeping the croft going in the same way that Reverend Smith was able to keep his croft going? Would I, or do I have to do it under the CAG scheme so that it seemed to be more official? That's my question.
No, I don't think it has to be through a CAG scheme. I think, as long as you can show that you're doing that on the apportionment, then I think that would satisfy the Crofting Commission. Yeah.
The only thing about the apportionments, there always seems to be a no man's land. You don't get grants if you don't get this or that. Sort of in between ourselves and the common grazing. But yeah. I'm thinking that this would be helpful towards Neil during his time as an absentee landlord, which will probably be 5 years, which is the maximum you're allowed. But I am in the process of thinking of handing over, but maybe just waiting till I keel over. But we'll have to wait and see. That he's nominated, and so that, and I know he's interested very much in agriculture himself and sheep. So, right. So that would be good. But it was a very interesting talk. I'll give you that, and really the types of trees I'll be very interested in too, because we did all these downy birches, we did the hollies, we did the aspens, we did the hawthorns, and they're all, some of them are gone all right, lower down, but the ones that either got blown away or smothered, I don't know what we're going to do there, but I think I'm about to, somebody suggested here setting fire to the lot, and that you'd get ash that would be a good fertilizer. That's a crofter that believes in fire.
Yes. Yes. That sounds a bit drastic.
But I have now decided that I've shot myself in the foot well and properly, because not only have I said, okay, we'll continue with the no stock, I put a fence up so that there is stock now on one side of the fence eating the olive grass very nicely, and my poor trees are still smothered, so I don't know where they've gone. I'll have to go up presumably with a strimmer and do management, but I'd be interested in grants, and if you'd like to tell me about them more, it might be more applicable to me, and I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you very much.
Well, certainly, I'll get in touch and I'll arrange to visit Scott, maybe when I'm next coming up to Harris. I'll manage to visit. Yeah, because it sounds like there's quite a lot to discuss there. I've just one note of caution with strimmer use. Be very careful if you're strimming around trees, because if you take any of the bark off, you'll know yourself, if you take any bark off the tree, it will tend to die. So you don't want that happening. But yes, I mean, well done with your efforts. I'm sorry it hasn't worked too well to start so far. But
we'll get there.
You'll get there. Good on you for persevering.
Yeah. Kind of, just a wee follow-up of what Scott said there. Is there a lot of work involved in the upkeep?
Well, there's a bit of work for the first couple of years, I would say, and I think the idea really is to put that work in at that time, because by that stage the trees should be established and shouldn't need anything after that. But there is a potential for them to get smothered by grasses and things in those early years. So various ways of dealing with that. But yeah, there is a wee bit of work. So it's not just plant them and walk away. And I think that's kind of what people perhaps have thought a bit in the past, just plant them and walk away. Yeah. But you do need to go around at least a couple of times in the summer and just check that they're all right.
Okay, that's good to know. We planted I think there's about 300 here around Talanamara, and I've certainly not checked them, so it's good to know that there's still a little bit more work that might need to be done. So that's interesting, at least.
And it's something, I mean, if it's a community group that's planted them, you know, there might be one or two folk that are keen enough to turn out and just go around and check them a couple of times in the summer. And that kind of keeps people engaged with it as well, you know.
Yeah, that's quite true. That's quite true. Is the scheme quite easy to kind of apply to and to access? Is it fairly straightforward?
Do you mean the community packs?
Just any of them in general. So looking at are they quite easy to get around, or is there quite a lot of work involved?
I mean, if you're thinking about going for a grant, I'd have a chat with me first, because for the Morewoods grant, I basically do it all for you rather than you having to apply online. I can do it all for you. That's part of my job. And for the community packs, it's the same thing. And school packs, I sort of organise it all for people. The forestry grant scheme is a bit more complicated. It's an online application process, and it's quite you have to produce digital maps and all that kind of thing. So what I tend to do with that one is to, once we've agreed all the details and people want to go ahead, is that I then appoint an agent to do all the mapping and stuff, because it just takes time and I haven't got that really. And so that the application is put in on the crofter's behalf at no cost to you. But it's a more complicated application process, certainly.
Okay. Excellent.
But speak to me first. I'll be deluged now.
Just coming back to you for a moment on the tree species. You mentioned New Zealand holly, and Margaret and I planted a dozen New Zealand holly along a seaward-facing fence of one of the buildings at Bournemouth, and one of them we left over because couldn't get a space for it, and put it in another place with a shelter. The 11 died, and the one that had the shelter didn't. And it just shows you how strong the wind is. And then again, I've noticed too that if you use trees that succeed here, and I'm trying to remember the name as I talk, of bushes that I'm sure they won't mind me mentioning their name, and Dan and Jeff are here, but the bushes are grown by Morag MacDonald and Roddy Alec, and they're to be seen on their front drive, and they're quite slender and very green, and have quite a lot of trunk for the first 2-3 feet, and then they have this lovely effect of I don't know how you would describe it, but it's very, and it begins with an A, because Morag is going to give me some cuttings for an embankment I've got here. There's a special name, and I think following local success stories is a good idea.
Yes, absolutely. I'd second that. I'm afraid I can't think of that tree you're describing. But...
Do you know it, Diana? You'll see it outside the.
Sorry. I'll have to have another look.
Well,
you can let Ian know, and he can tell us.
Yeah, I wrote it down, but there you go.
Does anybody else have any points they want to raise or chat about? Everybody else has gone off for coffee, I think.
Any more questions? No, I think that is us. Well, Viv, just once again, thank you very much.
You're very welcome
for giving us your time. It's been great. It's been excellent just to finally meet you. Well, speak to you rather.
Yes.
So it's been great. Have you got anything coming up just now? Are you guys planning anything new have you got any new schemes or any new work that you'd like to kind of plug a wee bit?
Not specifically, no. I'm at the moment I'm working on as well as all the kind of getting people's grants processed and everything, there's a project at the moment with primary schools in Lewis, which is basically planting a tree for every new primary one child that comes in the autumn term. And it's a sort of joint project between the Rotary and Point and Sandwich Trust. So I'm involved with that at the moment, and we're doing that in 6 schools. And the hope is that if it's successful, and I can't see why it wouldn't be, then we'll be able to roll it out to Harris and to US and Barra later on next year, maybe. So that's quite a nice one. I do a bit with, I do a bit with schools, not as much as I'd like, really, because I'm deluged with crofters. So, I just have to.
Another one that I dealt with in that scheme side of things was the country file scheme earlier in the year, when if you planted more than 20 trees as part of their week's effort, you would get your place of residence would be noted. And we went for that. We put some more trees in the apportionment at the time, but they're encouraging everybody to plant trees and probably do it annually. So country file we seem to be on their map, so we better make sure they're growing.
Well, that's good. I wasn't aware of that scheme, so that's good. That sounds great.
There's the Queen's Platinum Jubilee project, isn't there? For next
That's right. That's right, Diana. Yes, there's Queen's Green Canopy, it's called. Yeah. I'm still trying to think of a way to actually kind of tie in with that, but it would be good to do something. Yes. Have you got any ideas about how you might do something related with trees with that?
We'll have to have a think.
answers on a postcard. Yeah, I need to have a think, and quite soon actually, because the year is moving on, isn't it? So yeah, it would be great to do something in the Western Isles to do with that. Yeah, and it's a project the Woodland Trust is heavily involved in, so I think I'll be encouraged to get involved with that. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, Viv, once again, thank you for your time. I'm just going to end the recording.